All right. We are going to start out our hybrid security section here talking about Sentinel. The exact exam objective is listed there, where basically they're talking about setting up on-premise and Azure IaaS VMs to monitoring to write to Azure Sentinel. Because it's an Azure product, we're going to have to go over a little bit of the Azure side. It doesn't say in the exam objectives that you really need to understand too much about Sentinel, but we're going to spend some time going over what it is. We're going to browse through an overview page and kind of hit on the major features so you at least have an understanding and you can explain it if needed. But we're not going to spend too much time into going into in depth in Sentinel because it's a very big product and it can do a lot of things. So because that's not explicitly called out by the exam objectives, we're going to skip over the details and kind of just talk about it at a high level. We are also going to talk about Analytics Workspaces. That's an Azure product that Sentinel is built on top of, so we're going to need to know, what it is and how to use it. And that's also referred to as Azure Monitor, which is kind of a whole product that ties into Analytics Workspace. We'll get into that a little bit when we're talking about the topic. And finally, the way that we configure VMs or on-premise server to talk to the Analytics Workspace and therefore Azure Sentinel is by using VM extensions in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to go over, we're going to touch on a little bit of what VM extensions are, how to deploy them, and then how it ties specifically into the Azure Monitor agent and talk about what our options are for deploying that agent, because that's specifically what the exam calls out. So with that being said, hold on, let me jump around a little bit here. Let's cut over to our Sentinel page. So I had to click through a couple tabs there to find it. This is the Sentinel overview page. Like I said, we're going to talk just real quick on a high level what this is about. Sentinel is essentially these two types of product, a SIEM and a SOAR product. And if you're wondering what the acronyms, SIEM is Security Information Event Management, and SOAR is Security Orchestration Automation Response. Essentially what that means is Sentinel is a big log aggregator product that you can send all of your security logs to, and it is very good at interpreting those logs and then generating some sort of events out of it, or like correlating when you might have an issue based on the logs that it's getting from a bunch of different products. So the other very similar product that's universally used or used all over the place is called Splunk. Does the same thing. Splunk is a dedicated SIEM, and then I've never heard the term SOAR outside of this, but essentially, if you interpret that, that's just using some sort of automation to trigger alerts and incidents based on the logs you're getting. So I'm sure you can use it to either open a ticket in ServiceNow or your ticketing portal, or you could use it to maybe even resolve an issue if you want to do that level of automation. But essentially, it's saying you can watch for certain events and then trigger an automation off of those events in order to remediate, either by generating a ticket or otherwise. The big things that Sentinel does is obviously it's just a place essentially that collects logs, the log aggregator. But what it can do then is connect using data connectors to a bunch of different sources. So specifically, the ones that we're interested in for the sake of our exam objective is aggregating log data from VMs themselves and events that are on those VMs. But I want to call out the fact that Sentinel itself can collect logs from just about anywhere. It comes with a whole suite of data sources. I don't think we really need to get into this too much, but if I click on this, does it give us a list of the different things? Not really, but just take it for granted that it has a large number of connectors that it can use to ingest data. Now, the other thing that it can do is, we'll talk about workbooks with Log Analytics Workspace, but you can it watches for alerts and then it uses analytics to try and tie together the events or alerts that it's getting and generate incidents for you. So this is part of the automation thing where it can use a form of intelligence to say, I'm getting a whole series of events related to this one thing. This should be an issue that I need to then assign to somebody to investigate. So it can do that sort of intelligent analysis that makes it a more advanced product than just collecting logs from everywhere. Finally, and this goes back to the SOAR concept, the automation, you can do all these investigations, but it also ties into, I missed the topic where it's talking about this. Oh, it ties into a number of different products. So If you're generating events, you can use Azure Logic apps, which are like a lightweight automation tool that can be used to connect a number of different services. So it can watch for a certain event and then trigger or create incidents somewhere else or automation in another product. And essentially, it's listed here. You can use Sentinel to integrate and generate events in all these other different products. And this is just a short list of examples. So you have ServiceNow, you can generate Teams messages, Slack messages, you can generate alerts in Defender for endpoints or cloud apps. It integrates with all those products. So you have a lot of available integrations that you can do with Sentinel. That's as much as I'm going to get into it. I think you can probably get the idea already just by scrolling through this page. It does a lot of stuff, but it's all security focused and it's driven by the data that you have Sentinel configured to ingest. So it depends on your data sources, but it can do a lot of things. This is really standard for most SIEM products. All right, from here, let's skip over to our Azure portal and we are going to get started talking about Log Analytics Workspaces. Now, if you have used Azure at all or are getting into Azure, Log Analytics Workspaces, or LAWS for short, LAW, are kind of a fundamental piece to understand about the portal. Log Analytics essentially is it's like a storage account specifically for logs, and it stores logs generally from all over Azure. So it ties in directly to Azure Monitor. I can't remember what the legacy term was, but if you ever hear Azure Monitor being spoken of, oftentimes Azure Monitor and Log Analytics Workspaces are synonymous. Azure Monitor is kind of the back-end product for monitoring and logging, and a Log Analytics Workspace is the current product that's used to collect those logs. So you configure monitoring, it gets placed in a Log Analytics Workspace. The reason you need to know that is because Sentinel essentially is just a Log Analytics workspace, but it's one that's been enabled to become a Sentinel workspace instead. So let's go ahead and create a Log Analytics workspace here really quick so you can kind of get an idea of how it works. I'm doing this with the portal. My preferred way of doing it is IAC, but that's off topic, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But we type that into the marketplace. We go ahead and click to create one. And there's not too much here. I'm going to put it in the same resource group. I've got this is a Logins workspace used for Sentinel. I consider this a dev instance because these are all temporary lab resources, and I have it in each US region. That's my naming standard for things. That's pretty standard. Not going to worry about tags. And that's all the information that we need to create one of these. So let's go ahead and create. And it shouldn't take very long to create. So while this is creating, I'm going to talk about what we're going to do here for a sample. So obviously the objective is to stand up a Sentinel workspace. So that's what we're going to be doing. But in the meantime, I also want to talk a little bit about what Log Analytics workspaces are used for outside of Sentinel, because it's good for you to understand it. Looks like this is already created. So the main thing that you use these for is really any sort of logging, but almost every product in Azure has a section in the properties over here called diagnostic settings. If you can't see that, I wish I had a cursor indicator, but it's over here on the left under monitoring. I call this out because this is really where you do your log settings for any instance in Azure is going to be. So I'm in the resource group. So resource groups themselves don't actually have diagnostic settings, but what you can see if you're in the resource group view is all the resources that are in that resource group. So let's just say I wanted to configure logging for, oh, that's workspace. Let's actually do one step up. No, let's go ahead and do logging for this NSG. This network security group. This network security group is used to whitelist only my public IP address to access my lab resources here. But this is the same menu that you'd see in any resource if you're going under diagnostic settings. Essentially, it says that there's nothing here, but this is where you configure things to connect to a Log Analytics workspace. So if I wanted to configure all logs to be saved so that I could view them long term, I can check the box and then check the box to send to a Log Analytics workspace. And then because I only have one, default workspace gets created oftentimes in most resources, so I'm going to ignore this, but this is the one that we just created. I could select this box, name it NSG logging, and then I could save. And what that would do now is any logs attributed to this NSG, which are probably going to be things like blocked traffic requests, allowed traffic requests. Because an NSG is just a lightweight firewall rule, essentially, that's the sort of logs it would have. It would then, if I save this, it would then start writing those logs to a log Analytics workspace, and then I could query them using an Azure specific language called KQL instead of SQL. I'll let you do your own Googling on that, and essentially you could use that to query any logs that are stored in there. But this is how all logging is configured in Azure for any resource. You can configure logging on subscriptions, on NSGs, on VMs. Any PaaS resource is going to have logs, and you can define these logs in Azure Policy if you wanted to make sure that certain logs were enabled for certain resources. Like, for example, make sure that all subscriptions have audit logs enabled on them so you can see what resources are created or destroyed. That's a great standard practice you do with Azure Policy, written to a law, and then the law itself, you can define retention rules on there, how long you want that data to stay, who has access to it, that sort of thing. I'm not going to save these because we're going to use this log Analytics workspace for something else. But that is, in general, what a log Analytics workspace is used for. So let's go back to our resource group here and open our log Analytics workspace. All right, I had to pause here and look up how to make this work. So to turn this into a Sentinel workspace, we go to our search bar and we click on Microsoft Sentinel. This is its own portal, a list of resources for Sentinel, and I'm going to create. And here we select the law that we're going to use, click Add, and that configures it. Now, with any resource you're creating in Azure, this is just a side note. You want to make sure before you create it, especially if you're doing it in a lab environment, you go and look at pricing first. I was under the impression that Sentinel was one of the services where as soon as you create it, you get charged a flat fee that could be significant. Fortunately for our lab environment here, that's not the case. But I always encourage people, especially if you're just starting to learn Azure, go look at pricing first. Sentinel, it looks like I activated a free trial. Didn't realize I had one, but that's how it works. By default, with some things you get free trials, but I do know Sentinel also has let's see, is it under Workspace Manager settings? It has different pricing tiers. Here they are. So you get charged per gigabyte of data that's ingested in Sentinel. By default, you're on a pay-as-you-go subscription, so you get $4.30 per gig of data ingested. If we're doing a small lab here, you're going to get kilobytes of data probably, and you're not really going to have to worry about it, which is why I'm standing this up. But if you do, or if you're in an organization you need to scale up, you have the ability to get discounts if you are paying for a flat rate for a certain amount of data per day. Just wanted to call that out as we're setting it up. But that's it. That's the overview of Log Analytics and Sentinel, how you deploy it. It's very straightforward to deploy and configure. But the next piece is going to be a little more complicated, and that's actually deploying or configuring our virtual machines to write their logs to Sentinel. So I'm going to navigate back to my resource group here. And all right. Plan is, so the exam objective is to configure Azure IaaS VMs or on-prem servers to write data to Azure Sentinel. The method for configuring servers are going to be about the same, but I'm going to quick mention if you are deploying, if you want Windows 10 or 11 devices to write their logs to Sentinel, it's a little bit different. For those clients, you would actually download Azure Monitor Agent installer and deploy them to the workstations. So if you're a Windows 10 or Windows 11 workstation, that's how you do it. If you're running a server, it's different. Now, I'm going to connect quick to the server just to show this. We're going to work our way backwards. Let's pull up our RDP connection. This is our lab management server that we're going to configure to write to Sentinel. But I want to point out, if this was an on-prem VM, oh, you know what? Let me turn off my camera here really quick because it's in the bottom corner. You'll see this little Azure Arc icon down here. This is installed now in 2022. I think it was pushed out to other OS versions also with a recent Windows update. But what Azure Arc is it's used to connect your on-prem servers or VMs to Azure. When you enable that and configure Azure Arc, you now have ability to manage your on-prem servers using your Azure data plane. I mention this because if you're deploying an Azure Monitor agent, which is required to write logs to Sentinel, this is how they want you to do it for on-prem servers. You configure Azure Arc, which is a separate process, and then once Azure Arc is configured, you then configure the monitoring agent the same way you would with an Azure IaaS VM, which we're going to show next. So I'm bringing this RDP session up just to show you the little Azure Arc piece, because that's the piece you'd use for on-premise VMs. Go ahead and turn my camera back on here and switch back over to our portal. All right, this is the server we're just on, management P1. I hope you're seeing my mouse. It doesn't matter. The way that you configure a virtual machine to write logs to Log Analytics Workspace or to Sentinel. Now, we use those terms interchangeably, but those might not always be the same thing. For any VM, if you want to enable any sort of VM insights, which is a kind of advanced Azure recommendations service, or if you wanted to make sure you're saving logs for your virtual machine, the first thing you have to do is configure the Azure monitoring agent. That's what's called a VM extension that's used to write logs to your Log Analytics Workspace. Now, that's also what you use for Sentinel, because once your VM is configured to write its logs to Log Analytics Workspace, you target it to your Sentinel law, and then that's how it's configured to write logs to it. So that's what we're going to do. Now, VM extensions are in settings. On the left-hand side here, you can see extensions and applications. Extensions are essentially things that you deploy to a virtual machine that's already stood up after the fact, and it allows an integration with that virtual machine to something. You'll see this VM has a join domain extension. This is how, when I stand up my lab, I'm configuring my virtual servers to connect to my AD domain. Extensions are a little goofy in the sense that you have an add button here, but this menu has very limited ability of what extensions you can actually deploy. The domain join one is not here. The Azure Monitor agent also is not here, but every documentation reference you'll read says you need to use the Azure Monitor agent extension, VM extension, in order to deploy the Azure Monitor agent. So I want to open this to show you this is a very limited use portal. If you're deploying extensions, most of them need to be deployed in some other method, and it's pretty standard the way you deploy them. You have Azure CLI as your command line interface you can use. You have PowerShell, which PowerShell seems to be the most verbose mechanism you have for listing and installing applications based on what I was reading. I'm not going to get too far into it because we're only focused on one, but if you are trying to determine them, I would start by Googling and go off their reference, and if I need to dig into it, it looks like PowerShell has quite a few commandlets you can use to find and install and add extensions to a VM. But in this case, for the monitoring agent, there's a few different places you can go. If you're in the VM properties in the portal, like this is for our management P1 VM here, I can go down to diagnostic settings. I believe this would install it. Otherwise, I can go to insights, and there's this little enable button. I believe this would install the Azure Monitor agent. But we're going to be talking in a little bit about the Defender for Cloud portal. So let's go there, because that's another mechanism you can use to push the agent. If I go to Defender for Cloud, and like I said, I'm going to talk about this a little bit, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. That'll be one of the next videos. If I go to Inventory, and I see my two VMs here, I'm going to go ahead and click into the one that I want to push the agent to. One of the recommendations the Defender for Cloud portal will give me is your Log Analytics agent should be installed on virtual machines. Log Analytics agent is equivalent to the Azure Monitor agent. These terms are used interchangeably. Documentation says Azure Monitor. This is Log Analytics. Doesn't matter. Same thing. The other mechanism for deploying this extension that I will call out is you can use Azure Policy. Azure Policy is like your GPOs for all of your Azure resources. It's used to enforce or deploy things. I'm not going to go with that example here, but it is an option as well if you want to make sure it's enabled on all your virtual machines. For the sake of deploying this for our demo, I'm going to go ahead and click in here, and one of the options you get straight from the Defender for Cloud portal on the recommendation once it loads. You have a little fix button here. If I click fix, it asked me specify the workspace ID. This is asking you what workspace do you want to configure the logs to write to. And I'm going to go ahead and click this one because it's our Sentinel workspace we stood up. We have our VM here that we're configuring. And you can't see it because it's below the bar here. But see, can I do this? Yep. I have my button here to fix my one resource. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and you'll see the remediation starting here. Scale my browser back up while it's doing that. And I'm going to wait for this to finish, and I'll come back here in a second. All right, our fix has now been deployed. I fast forwarded a little bit here. So let's go ahead and go to Sentinel and finish configuring this to write Windows events to our Sentinel instance. Let's close the notifications here. Let's pull up our Sentinel Log Analytics Workspace, and you'll see here that it's empty. We don't currently have any data, which makes sense because we just stood it up. But the next thing we have to do to configure Sentinel to start receiving those logs from its Windows clients, and this would be the same for any Azure IaaS VM or on-prem server. Now remember, if you have an on-prem server, the Azure Arc agent has to be configured so you can manage the server in the Azure portal the same way, just as a refresher there. Let's come back here, and the next thing we have to do is configure what's called a data connector. Data connectors, as a reminder, are the rules that you use to tell Sentinel what data do you want to ingest, and let's make it happen. So by default, nothing is configured, but let's go to the Content Hub listed here. And for servers, we want to search for Windows Security, and we have a Windows Security Events data collector right here. So I'm going to check the box, and let's go ahead and install this. This is kind of like the last one. If I go hide my camera here, the install button is down the bottom right. And we'll see that it's installing right now. All right, fast forwarded while this is happening, and see that it is successfully installed. So let's go back to data connectors and refresh. It says that there was an error, but I don't think we're have a problem. So this is security events via legacy agent. If you see references to legacy agent, that was the old way of connecting logs. Because we're doing things the new way using the Azure monitoring agent, we don't need to worry about the legacy. Instead, we're going to focus on Windows security via AMA. AMA is Azure Monitor Agent, the extension we just installed to our VMs. So down in the bottom right here, this portal's killing me with these on and offs here. We have the Open Connector Page button. So I'm going to click on that to get to the connector. And in this page, you have the option to configure rules. So I'm going to go ahead, go down here to create data collection rule. And you specify, I need to name the rule. So DCR for data collection and Windows events. And next. And now I'm selecting the resources that I want to collect these Windows events from. I only have the one. So I want to check the server, but it looks like if I wanted to, I could check the box to select everything in a subscription, or I could check it for an individual resource or the resource group itself. In this case, this is the only server I have the agent installed on, so this is the only thing that's going to work, but that's what we're going to do. So hit next and specify what events I want to stream. I'm going to choose all security events, and last thing but not least, go ahead and create. Alright, and that is it. So if I refresh this, sometimes the Azure portal is a little weird. Let's click out and click back in. It's giving me unexpected errors, but I don't think that's actually going to affect what we're doing here. And right there, you can see we've got our Windows event rule that's configured to start bringing logs into Sentinel. I don't know how long this is going to take to populate, but I might cut out one more time here and see once I've got a little bit of logs, and we will see what is happening after this has been populated. But this just about wraps up the topic for Sentinel. So to give you a quick overview, let's go back up here. pull this up. We Our objective here is monitoring on-premise servers and Azure IaaS VMs using Sentinel. We talked about what Sentinel is, what are some of the features you can get out of it. We talked about the fact that if you're doing on-prem, you have to configure your Azure Arc agent first so you can manage the server in Azure. Once you can manage the server with Azure, you can configure it the same way you do with an Azure IaaS VM, which is by using extensions. We talked about what extensions are a little bit. We don't need to get too far in depth with them, but the one extension we know was a requirement to use this was the Azure Monitor Agent. So we talked about the different methods for deploying that. You can either deploy it in the portal directly into the settings of a VM. You can use the Defender for Cloud portal and look at the remediation listed there, which is what we did. And then you also have the option to use Azure Policy if you want to configure it as kind of like a GPO setting for all your VMs to make sure that's enabled. Once that was enabled, we stood up our Sentinel instance, and then we went and created what is called a data collector rule in Sentinel. And a data collector rule is then configured to grab all Windows event logs from the VMs with that Azure monitoring agent and import them into our Sentinel instance. I might throw up a last little section on this once the logs populate so you can see them, but that is the whole configuration from start to finish. Now that those logs are going to be ingested, you can use the Sentinel product to trigger events, to trigger warnings, emails, to monitor any sort of events that are coming from all of the servers you have configured in one central place. And that's the purpose of Sentinel as a SIEM product. But that covers the video, and our next topic we'll get into after this is taking a closer look at the Defender for Cloud portal that we kind of saw referenced here, and what are some features of that and the exam objectives we want to complete for that. But that's Azure Sentinel and Log Analytics Workspaces.